A movie that flops, you might be surprised to learn, is bad. No one wants a dud like Joker 2 or Mortal Engines or Battleship or Strange Worlds on their hands. But the studios that made those movies ended up surviving those flops. This video is not about those kinds of movies. No, here I want to explore the movies that flopped so bad they ended up shutting their production studios down. It's a rare occurrence to be sure, but it happens more often than you'd think. Franchise Pictures wasn't even around for 10 years before it was sent to the great beyond. Founded in 1997, the studio focused on producing action, thriller, and comedy movies, and it's really not hard to see why they didn't last. You see, almost none of their movies made any money, which is something of a slight problem for a studio. The Boondock Saints did well on home video and syndication, while the whole 9 yards did make some money it seems. But looking at their entire filmography, I'm pretty sure that was it. That does make it a little hard to determine which of the many flops were the ones to sink the studio, but I think a strong case can be made for their most infamous flop, and one of the most infamous flops of all time, Battlefield Earth. It's the movie that led to a lawsuit and showed that the studio fraudulently inflated budgets to secure larger investments and spent much less using the difference to cook the books. Battlefield Earth, released in 2000, was John Travolta's passion project based on L. Ron Hubbard's science fiction novel of the same name. Set in the year 3000, the film depicted humanity enslaved by an alien race called the Cyclos, with Travolta playing the villainous alien Terrell. The movie became infamous for its bizarre production choices, including Dutch angles in way too many shots, garish color grading, and incomprehensible plotting. Critics savaged the film, and Roger Ebert gave it one of my favorite reviews, quote, "I watched it in mounting gloom, realizing I was witnessing something historic, a film that for decades to come will be the punchline of jokes about bad movies. There is a moment here when the Cyclos' entire planet, home office and all, is blown to smithereens without the slightest impact on any member of the audience, or for that matter, the cast. If the film had been destroyed in a similar cataclysm, there might have been a standing ovation," end quote. Despite Travolta's star power and a reported $73 million budget, which actually wasn't $73 million, the movie grossed only $29 million domestically and became an instant punchline in Hollywood. It's widely hailed as one of the worst movies ever made and was one of the biggest flops ever. The financial impact on Franchise Pictures was devastating, though not immediate, but Battlefield Earth's failure drew attention to the company's accounting practices. In 2004, a consortium of German investors who had financed several franchise picture films, including Battlefield Earth, filed a fraud lawsuit claiming that the studio had inflated budgets by tens of millions. Court documents showed that while Battlefield Earth's budget was reported at $73 million on production and $20 million on marketing, only about $44 million was actually spent on production. Franchise Pictures lost the lawsuit and was ordered to pay $121 million in damages. Unable to satisfy the judgment, the company filed for bankruptcy and ceased operations in August of 2004, a sad end after an odd movie. De Laurentiis Entertainment Group, or DEG, was founded in 1986 by legendary Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis, whose career stretched back to the 1940s and spanned over 500 movies. I mean, the guy was productive as hell, producing movies like La Strada, Serpico, Conan the Barbarian, Manhunter, a remake of King Kong, and more. But it'd be a lie to say that DEG ever really found its footing. Much like Franchise Pictures, it's difficult to pinpoint a single film because pretty much all of them lost money. The fact that it lasted a few scant years up until 1989 is impressive unto its own because it had exactly 2 movies, so far as I could tell, that made money. 1986's King Kong Lives, which it produced, and 1989's Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which it distributed. Everything else lost money. But again, here we find one movie that's emblematic, if not precipitant, of the fall. Taipan, released in 1986, was based on James Clavell's best-selling historical novel about British traders in 1840s Hong Kong. Perhaps De Laurentiis envisioned an epic spectacle that would rival David Lean's historical dramas, with elaborate period detail, massive sets, and international intrigue. That wasn't necessarily what we got. The film starred Brian Brown as Dirk Strawn, the Taipan, which Clavell translated as supreme leader of a trading company navigating the opium wars, typhoons, and rival merchants. Despite its ambitious scope and $25 million budget, DG's most expensive film, the movie suffered from narrative incoherence and failed to capture the novel's sprawling complexity. Director Daryl Duke struggled to bring Clavell's 700-odd-page epic onto the screen, resulting in a confusing melodrama that felt both rushed and interminable. To be fair to Duke, though, he was outmatched. Many directors, actors, and writers had tried to bring the book to screen since its publication in 1966, and none of them had been successful. Beyond that, it was one of the first English-language films shot in China, which brought its own issues. De Laurentiis wasn't just fighting to make a movie, he was fighting the Chinese government, it turns out. All of that for a disastrous result. The movie made just $2 million at the box office, not even 10% of its budget, and that doesn't even account for marketing. Critically, it wasn't much better. The New York Times' Walter Goodman said, amusingly, quote, "You have to say this for Taipan. It's ridiculous, but in a big way. It's 2 hours of super comics, bearded brutes, busty bells, bloody blades, exotic settings, colorful costumes, a beheading, a castration, a typhoon," end quote. He might not have liked it much, but at least he was amused. The failure came at a critical moment for DEG, and it came quickly. The company had raised $240 million through an IPO, and De Laurentiis pre-sold most of the international rights, but burned through all that cash and was more than $16 million in debt by 1987. In 1988, he quit his own company and formed another one. DEG was eventually carved up and sold to other companies. The collapse of Ted Turner Pictures is actually the simplest out of any of these. There weren't a bunch of different films that one could make a good case for it. No, here it all boiled down to a single film. 2003's Gods and Generals. Ted Turner Pictures was the film production subsidiary of Turner Broadcasting System, which was formed by media mogul Ted Turner. It's the kind of thing that I would do if I had the sufficient capital. Start a studio and fund a bunch of movies that I want to see made. Turner did something similar here. He's a big Civil War buff and wanted to produce a prestige historical epic, certainly in the David Lean vein, about America's deadliest conflict. He found his vehicle through Jeffrey Sharrow's 1996 novel, Gods and Generals. The novel is a prequel to Sharrow's father's Pulitzer Prize-winning 1974 novel, The Killer Angels, which was adapted as 1993's Gettysburg. A critical success but commercial flop. Still, that's more than could be said for Gods and Generals, but more on that in a second. At first, Turner tried to get his parent studio, Warner Brothers, to take on this passion project of his. Films are expensive to make, and despite being rich as hell, I can understand why he didn't want to spend his own money. But after they said no, Turner basically said, "Fine, I'll do it myself," and sank an astronomical $90 million into it. It's probably one of the most expensive indie movies out there, and perhaps the most expensive funded by a single individual. Turner had some reason to be hopeful. Despite flopping in theaters, Gettysburg still became a success thanks to its home video sales, and it had a cult following. Alas, it was not to be. Despite Ronald F. Maxwell returning to direct this one, it ended up being a commercial and critical disaster. First, the movie made less than $13 million, less than a quarter of the production budget alone. It was also damn near 4 hours long. That's better than the director's cut, which is 4 hours and 40 minutes long, but it still meant that you couldn't fit that many screenings into a day. Then, critics and historians ended up hating it. In this case, it wasn't over ideological divisions, as conservative and liberal outlets ended up bashing it. Jonathan Foreman, writing for the New York Post, wrote, quote, "The film's staggering incompetence can be measured by the way it makes some of the most fascinating and heart-rending episodes in American history tedious," end quote. Mick LaSalle at the San Francisco Chronicle, meanwhile, wrote, quote, "It's a plodding, episodic film, reverent and sanctimonious, and its pro-Southern viewpoint, a time-honored Hollywood tendency, makes Gone with the Wind look like a Northern polemic," end quote. And Civil War historian Stephen Woodworth called it, quote, "the most pro-Confederate film since Birth of a Nation, a veritable celluloid celebration of slavery and treason," end quote. And the film was widely seen as propagating the Lost Cause myth thanks to its hagiographic portrayal of traitors. What isn't a myth, though, is the effect that it had on Ted Turner Pictures. The movie basically shuttered it on account of being an unmitigated financial disaster. There was no trussing this one up, and no amount of home video sales could save it. Ted Turner Pictures was a one-and-done studio. C2 Pictures was founded in 1998 by Mario Kassar and Andrew Vania, both of whom made their names in the prior decade by producing successful films like Terminator 2, Total Recall, and Rambo: First Blood Part 2. After their previous production vehicle, Carolco Pictures, went bankrupt after a string of flops, the two decided to team up again to recapture the glory days. Fate, however, had other plans. As opposed to many of the other studios here, C2 only had a few proper releases. You can literally count them on one hand, and you don't even need all your fingers. There was 2002's I Spy, which made $60 million on $70 million. There was 2003's Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, which made $433 million on $187 million. There was 2006's Basic Instinct 2, which made $38 million on $70 million. And there was 2006's Children of Glory, which I couldn't find a budget for. But this wasn't the 80s and 90s anymore. The 80s were great for action films, and the 90s were a great decade for original films, but IP was becoming the main attraction in the aughts. And while their work at Carolco was able to capture the zeitgeist, that wasn't the case at C2. Basic Instinct 2, released in 2006, was the long-delayed sequel to Paul Verhoeven's controversial 1992 erotic thriller. Sharon Stone reprised her iconic role as Catherine Trammell, now relocated to London where she becomes entangled with a psychiatrist. The film attempted to recapture the original sexual transgression and psychological gamesmanship, but instead became instant camp. One big issue is that you don't try to follow up Paul Verhoeven's movies. It never works out well, and while Mal Catton-Jones is a competent director, he's no Verhoeven. It didn't help that there was more than a decade between the two movies, and Sharon Stone didn't seem particularly ecstatic to be there either. It also didn't help that Catton-Jones hated it as much as critics did. In his words, quote, "It was the experience of making it. It was horrible, and I knew before I started that it wasn't going to be a particularly good film, which is a very, very painful thing," end quote. He was upfront as to why he made the movie. He needed the money. I respect the honesty, frankly. After the flop, Kasser and Vania decided to close up shop. Unlike Carol Co's spectacular end, C2 went with a whimper. They sold off the Terminator rights, and that was that. Basic Instinct 2, meanwhile, is considered to be one of the worst sequels ever made. The movie's moment had passed, and there was just no way to recapture the past. The tale of Cinergi Pictures, run by the aforementioned Andrew Vania, is the tale of so many movie studios. Over the course of 10 years, they put out a lot of movies, some famous, some infamous, most of them flops, but a couple of hits. The first two movies, Medicine Man and the Super Mario Bros. Movie, were total duds, but they sprang to life with Tombstone towards the end of 1993. 1995's Die Hard with a Vengeance was another big hit, but then besides 1996's Evita, nothing else seemed to make any money. It got so bad that one movie they sank $28 million into, Broadway Brawler, never even got a release. Like so many other studios, they were too ambitious for their own good. It's fine to want to make a lot of movies, but when so many flops get corralled together, you end up digging a financial pit that can be hard to get out of. And perhaps the movie that dug their biggest pit was 1995's Judge Dredd. The movie was based on the character created by John Wagner, Carlos Ezquerra, and Pat Mills. It starred Sylvester Stallone as the titular feature lawman in the dystopian Megacity 1, where the judges serve as judge, jury, and executioner. Director Danny Cannon created a visually impressive production with elaborate sets, costumes, and effects that were meant to bring the comics' ultraviolence to life. Alas, the film ran into issues as soon as it started. First, the film had to be recut half a dozen times because it kept getting an NC-17 rating, which would have dramatically reduced how many people would see it. The darker, more violent tone of the film was neutered against Cannon's wishes, and the studio and Stallone tried to make it more humorous. Then Stallone and Cannon clashed. Stallone was a star at this point, and Cannon was still coming up. Compared to Stallone, Cannon had remained relatively tight-lipped about what happened, but said that he would not work with another big-name star ever again. Stallone, meanwhile, said, quote, "Some of the design work on it was fantastic, and the sets were incredibly real, even standing 2 feet away, but there was just no communication. I knew we were in for a long shoot when, for no explainable reason, Danny Cannon, who's rather diminutive, jumped down from his director's chair and yelled to everyone within earshot, 'Fear me, everyone should fear me,' then jumped back up to his chair as if nothing happened," end quote. All can be forgiven if a movie does well, though. That didn't happen here. It made $113 million on a $90 million budget, a surefire flop. On top of that, it got savaged by critics as well as by John Wagner, who said, quote, "The first film really had nothing to do with Judge Dredd," end quote. This was just one more flop on top of Shadow Conspiracy, Nixon, The Scarlet Letter, and more for Cinergi. It was unsustainable to have so many movies in the $40 to $90 million range flop one right after another. By 1997, Cinergi had all but collapsed, and Disney wound up buying their library. Global Road Entertainment is one of the companies that actually managed to cling on, though it was all but forced to rebrand to what is now Open Road Entertainment. It was created when Open Road Films merged with IM Global in 2017. They had ambitious plans, spent $1 billion on films with budgets between $20 million and $100 million, and finance up to 15 movies a year between 2017 and 2020. As Global Road Entertainment, however, that did not happen. In fact, they made it to around 14 films before running into financing issues in 2018. The big issues had to do with the box office totals of the movies. Things actually started off well. 2018's Midnight Sun and Show Dogs ended up making money, but they soon ran into some snags. It came at them from two ends. First, the merger seemed to be one of necessity as opposed to from a position of strength. They only financed 2 movies that cost more than $25 million. Most of their releases were well below that, perhaps because that's all that they could afford. They said that they wanted to spend $1 billion, but getting that money was a challenge and the company was not able to raise the necessary funds. The company ended up having to rest all of its hopes on 2018's Axel, a $9 million film about a teenage boy who befriends a robot dog. It was based on a short film that director Oliver Daly had made, and it could have been interesting. Alas, it ran into predictable cliches. Bully teen finds robot and befriends it, corporation wants robot back, chaos ensues. Katie Rife at the AV Club said, rather harshly, quote, Something worse than bad. It's utterly forgettable, unquote. The movie had potential, but was unable to live up to it. It was also unable to live up to the immense hopes placed on it. After getting bashed by critics, it made just $15 million at the box office. That was all that the studio's lenders needed to see. The company was taken over by Bank of America and East West Bank in August of 2018 and was forced to lay off employees without severance. They started to sell off other movies that they were working on before filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September of 2018. Then they were forced to sell themselves to Raven Capital Management. In June of 2020, the company came back as Open Road Films. The second incarnation's luck has not been much better, with only one success out of 10 2020s after we collided. Their fate is to be determined. I think the collapse of Daisy Miller and the director's company might be the most important of all of these failures. The company was founded in the early 1970s as a groundbreaking experiment in filmmaker autonomy within the studio system. It was started at Paramount by Francis Ford Coppola, William Friedkin, and Peter Bogdanovich. The intent was simple. They could make any movie they wanted for $3 million or less and produce someone else's movie for up to $1.5 million. Beyond that, they had free reign over the production. They started strong with Bogdanovich's Paper Moon in 1973. It turned $31 million on $2.5 million and won critical acclaim as well as Oscars. Then Coppola made The Conversation. It turned $5 million on $1.6 million, but also won the Palme d'Or at Cannes and was a critical hit. Paramount got some prestige from it and was happy, but tension bubbled under the surface. First, these three were headstrong, intense guys, auteurs in the truest sense. It was their way or the highway, and they stuck to their guns. Hell, Coppola and Friedkin were willing to risk life and limb for their movies. They chafed under any kind of oversight Paramount might try to exert, but they also chafed at each other's opinions. They would end up passing on funding Star Wars after Coppola brought it to them. Both Friedkin and Bogdanovich didn't think that it could work, which turned out to be inaccurate in hindsight. The end came with 1974's Daisy Miller, directed by Bogdanovich for $2.2 million. It was based on Henry James' 1878 novella about an American woman, Daisy Miller, who runs afoul of European social customs much to the chagrin of Frederick Winterbourne, who's into her but also wants to retain a status in society. That is to say, this was not a commercial film, and Bogdanovich would say that he shouldn't have made it. In his words, quote, "I thought that it would not be a very commercial picture, but I thought we'd made 3 in a row. What's wrong with making one that wasn't so commercial? This is not a good way to think," end quote. It also didn't help that Friedkin and Coppola thought that this was a vanity project so that he could make his girlfriend at the time, Sybil Shepherd, a star. While it was a small flop, the failure had disproportionate consequences for the director's company. Frank Yablans, who never liked the idea of the production company as an autonomous force, now had a reason to rail against it. The directors involved weren't particularly happy either, but more than that, it was a harbinger of what was to come. Bogdanovich and Friedkin would run into box office issues by the end of the decade, while Coppola would run into his own on 1982's One from the Heart. As Peter Bart later wrote, quote, "Had the company survived, these three and other filmmakers had much to gain from it. All three of the founding filmmakers went on to display rather arcane choices in material for their next films. All could have benefited from a collegial give and take with their peers," end quote. Alas, it wasn't to be. The director's company shuttered by the end of 1974. Bangkok Dangerous is a fascinating case because not only did it take down one company, it took down 2. Production company IEG, or Initial Entertainment Group, and producer-distributor Virtual Studios. It's almost kind of impressive, and while they had many flops, one can also track their collapse itself to a single film. The 2008 film was a remake of the Peng brothers' 1999 film Bangkok Dangerous. Nicolas Cage had bought the rights to make a remake and also starred in it. He plays a hitman who travels to Bangkok in order to carry out a series of hits. Predictably, things go awry. Cage starred in this movie before the time that he had to take any role that came his way in order to get himself out of a financial pit, though considering the eventual box office and critical reception of the movie, one would be hard-pressed to discern where the issues actually began. Virtual Films had some initial success with movies like V for Vendetta and 300, but most of their movies didn't make enough to recoup their budget. By the time that Bangkok Dangerous came out, they hadn't had a hit in years, and after the movie flopped, the company ceased working on other films before closing shop in 2009. It was a similar situation with IEG. The company was much older, producing its first film, Rent-A-Kid, back in 1995. Then it had a series of duds until 2000's Traffic was a hit at the box office, after which they produced several Leonardo DiCaprio and Scorsese movies, including Gangs of New York, The Aviator, and The Departed, but between those it was dud after dud. After flopping on 2007's Next, another Nicolas Cage action vehicle, they made Garden of Eden and finished with Bangkok Dangerous. Similar to Global Road Entertainment, IEG wound up restructuring and changing its name to GK Pictures. To be sure, it takes a special kind of movie to lay low 2 companies. It's not easy or cheap to make movies, and a lot of movies do end up flailing at the box office. But as the studio's filmography shows, it's a lot more common than you would think. Still, it's a rare film that ends up tanking so hard at the box office that it pulls a company down under with it. But it has been known to happen, and until someone in Hollywood figures out the one true formula for box office success, it's going to keep happening. Still, I think the risk is also what makes it kind of exciting.